What is up, everybody? Mr. Curtis here. Welcome to the kind of second part of this unit on World War I and the Russian Revolution. This is obviously on the Russian Revolution. This takes place from pretty much 1917 to 1939, and I've taught this many times, and generally people get a little confused. There's no really perfect way to do this, and here's why it's a little confusing. World War I happens from 1914, and then essentially the Treaty of Versailles is officially recognized and signed in 1919. During World War I, the Russian Revolution happened. So 3.5 years into the war, the Russian Revolution is really kind of getting going. Here's the problem. We need to backtrack a little bit to pre-World War I here with the Russian Revolution because we have two events that are kind of overlapping that we're actually separating. So with that said, I want to backtrack pre-World War I. So forget everything you know about World War I and the fighting and Russia leaving the war and not being industrialized and all that stuff. So let's backtrack just for a second here. And I want to kind of explain some of these causes that are going on in Russia prior to World War I, prior to the Russian Revolution that are going to lead to this Russian Revolution happening. First thing, unlike the rest of Europe, the Western Europeans who have gone through the Enlightenment and have increased democratic ideas and freedoms, there is no democracy or very few freedoms in Russia in the early 1900s, pre-World War I. Russia is led by an absolute monarch. His name is Nicholas II. Generally, he's not looked at as like this evil villain like we look at a lot of other absolute monarchs. He's from the Romanov family who's been in power in Russia for over 300 years. So this is him. His family's been in power for a long time. But generally keep in mind that like we have Russians who are interacting with other people in Western Europe, but they don't have the same freedoms that other people in Europe have. So there's going to be a little bit of questioning going on over whether or not the absolute monarch is legitimate or should be in charge. Also, unlike Western Europe, Russia has failed to industrialize. They tried to industrialize in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They attempted to build up their industry and build railroads and build factories, but for the most part, it's been unsuccessful. Most of the people in Russia, unlike in Western Europe, and when I say Western Europe, just a reminder, I'm talking France and Britain and Germany, these countries that have successfully industrialized, who have most people by the start of World War I who are working in factories or urban areas as opposed to being farmers. We saw that shift in the Industrial Revolution. In Russia, we don't see that shift. Most people in Russia in the early 1900s are still peasants, still working on farms. The people who are working in factories are going to have poor working conditions. They have that early Industrial Revolution. If you think back to the urban game or the things that we talked about in class or in the videos, there are these poor working conditions that the Russians are dealing with. So the few people who are in urban areas, which is maybe 3 to 5% of the population, they are actually working in horrendously awful conditions in the 1900s. And if you compare that to Western Europe, who have rights in factories, who have specific work hour days and have voting rights and can actually change and are attempting to change these systems through unions, we don't see that in Russia. And actually in 1905, there's this little revolution that takes place in which the workers demand more rights and it's given by the government and then taken away. So causing all kinds of issues. The last thing and the most important thing to connect us with World War I is in World War I, Russia is fighting against Germany on the Eastern Front. Russia, as I said, is not industrialized. Germany is industrialized, and the only thing Russia has that really keeps them going, and they didn't have to leave the war sooner, is they have a large population. So they fight on the Eastern Front against Germany. They keep sending soldiers. Their soldiers are dying because they don't have as good of weapons. They don't have as good of clothing. They're just lacking food supply. So they're dying, but Russia has more and more soldiers continuing to come to the front. About 2 million soldiers are going to die from Russia in World War I. That is an amazingly large number. Think about it, 2 million people. The numbers of which are almost impossible to comprehend. We're talking an enormous, if you lived in Russia during this time, you would definitely have a family member, and we're talking 2 million males. So half the population, we're losing 2 million people. And you can imagine you'd probably know someone, whether it was a brother, a father, an uncle, a cousin, somebody who would have died during this war. Also, you have 10 million people wounded, 10 million people who are injured during this war. So 12 million people total who are affected physically as a result of this war, not to mention the psychological tolls that we talked about on the Western Front with shell shock and stuff. Also, people who are not involved in the war, people who are living at home, who are not directly fighting as soldiers in this war. There is a shortage in Russia of food and fuel, meaning that a lot of the food and fuel which is going to the front to feed the soldiers for the war effort is leaving a lot of people behind hungry. So you have people upset that the Tsar has gotten involved in this war. For what reason? For little old Serbia to protect them. You have people who are at home who are starving, and generally, if you haven't realized, when we talk about war or revolution, one thing that leads to these political revolutions is people are hungry. When people are hungry, they're hangry, and when they're hangry, they do things that they normally wouldn't do. So, what's the deal with this? While all this is happening, there is a communist group, a group made up of people who believe in Karl Marx's theory. And a little review on communism. Karl Marx believed, this is from back in the Industrial Revolution, that the workers and their conditions would get so bad that the workers would overthrow the owners and create a society in which everyone is equal. That system would be called communism, and this would be a worldwide revolution. In Russia, there is a group of communists who believe in this. They believe that the workers should overthrow the owners and create a society where everyone is equal. They are called the Bolsheviks. That's the name right there. That is exactly how it's pronounced. It is Bolshevik. I know it sounds like a bad word, but it's not. Bolshevik. This is their leader right here. His name is Vladimir Lenin. His actual name is, pardon my Russian pronunciation, is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. But he had tried to overthrow the government so many times before World War I with his Bolshevik group that he constantly is getting kicked out of the country. He is snuck back into the country during World War I by the Germans. And he takes on an alias or a pseudonym, which is Vladimir Lenin. So that's the name he has. His motto and his Bolsheviks group motto is peace, land, and bread. So think about this. He's promising the people of Russia, if they overthrow the Tsar and allow this Bolshevik group to come to power, they're promising them peace. So we'll end World War I. They'll promise lands. So if you're a peasant and you've been poor your whole life and you've been living on the land of your noble or someone who is a large land owning person, we'll give you land and we promise you bread. We give you food. 3 things that everyone wants. Really what we're talking about is everyone wants peace, everyone wants money, and land is money at this point, and everyone wants to have food in their stomach. So these 3 things, we're going to have peasants are going to support this, workers are going to support this, people who are against the war are going to support this, and eventually this communist group is going to rise up and lead this revolution. They are going to be successful, and they call this the Bolshevik or the Russian Revolution. And what occurs is, over the course of this revolution, they overthrow the Tsar. The Tsar actually steps down. He's like, this is crazy. I don't want anything part of this. And he steps down from power. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks come into power. So from 1918 to 1924, we have this guy, again, here he is, Vladimir Lenin in power. And Lenin says, we're eventually, like, communism is all about being equal, but we can't totally be equal yet. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, because if tomorrow in the United States, the government said, we're going to become communists and everyone's going to be equal. Everything's free. No one gets paid money. You go into a grocery store, you go into Best Buy, you take whatever you want. People would go crazy. And Lenin says, we can't do that. We got to transition into this communist way. So for a little while, I'm going to be dictator. And I'm going to be dictator and I'm going to rule this country with an iron fist and do what I want to do with the help of my Bolsheviks, because we're not ready to be communists yet. And when we are fully ready to be communists, I'll step back. But I'm only going to be there temporarily. And generally when people say they're going to be there temporarily, it means for the rest of their life. So he's going to implement a couple changes along with the Bolsheviks. One, he does redistribute land to the peasants, and the peasants are thrilled about this. This is a great way to get peasant support, and this is one of the reasons why the peasants supported Lenin and the Bolsheviks, because so he gives out land. 2, he allows workers to control the factories. So in a lot of ways, this is what communism was about. Instead of the owners controlling the factories, the workers control the factories. So he creates these worker groups who get to make decisions. It's like a little council of workers who decide the best way to run the factory. So we got peasants on our side, workers on our side. He also grants full female equality. Remember, communism is about equality and everyone being equal. He grants full female equality. Women can have received full education, which we don't see in Western Europe. Women are allowed to serve in the military, which is up even in places in like the United States. Full female equality in the military didn't really happen until a couple years ago. So we have these things which are granting full equality. So we got support of the peasants, trying to get support of workers, women. And one other thing which is a little tricky, he does allow for some capitalism. Remember, communism is about everyone being equal, where there's no real business owners and the workers control things and we share all the profits. He does kind of go back on this a little bit, and he creates something called the New Economic Policy. This pops up on the Regents every once in a while. It basically just allows for more capitalism. He does allow some businesses to make a profit and not to share all their profit with the workers. So we do see a little bit of capitalism, so it's not true communism. And lastly, Russia is going to call themselves the USSR. We're going to change the name. We're not going to be called Russia anymore. We officially changed the name to what is called the Soviet Union, which you may or may not have heard at some point in your life. And the USSR, which you really never have to memorize, but it's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but we'll call it the Soviet Union for short. So here's going to be the flag. We have the gold star here, which is always on the symbol, is one of the symbols of communist countries we usually see. We have the hammer here, which is going to symbolize the workers. We also have the sickle here, which you hold right here at the handle, and it chops down wheat or grain, and that symbolizes the peasants. So we have the workers and the peasants coming together to unite in this country. Here's the problem. Lenin's in power from 1918 to 1924. He's not overthrown. He's not assassinated. He has a couple strokes and he dies in 1924. Here's the problem. He's not a monarch. He's not an absolute monarch. So it's not like his son takes over next. And when he dies, there is no official successor named. So no one specifically is named to be next in charge. This is going to become a problem, which I'll get to in a second. This is Lenin. To this day, today, he is still on display. His body. This is really his body. His body is going to be basically on display from 1924 until the present moment. You can go and see his body. If you go to Russia, there's a mausoleum. This is what it looks like. If you want to pause it, you can read some of the descriptions if you're truly interested in this stuff. But they actually, his body is still on display. You can go there. You can view it. There are not a lot of pictures of it because it's actually illegal to take pictures of it while you're in there. But some people do, obviously. But this is him. This is what he looked like. This is his body. So he dies. And really when he dies, there's two primary options to become next in charge. One is this guy here. He looks like the Nutty Professor. He looks like some super dorky science guy who is like solving chemical equations in a laboratory somewhere. He's actually not. This is Leon Trotsky. He's actually the leader of the military. He runs what's called the Red Army. He runs the Bolshevik Army. He was the leader of the revolution. He's Lenin's boy. He's Lenin's guy. This is the guy that if Lenin had the choice and he didn't die from a stroke suddenly, this is who he would have chosen to be in charge. Leon Trotsky. The other guy is this guy, Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin, Stalin actually means man of steel. He's another guy who had to change his name, but this is Joseph Stalin here. He's the secretary of the Communist Party, and I don't mean secretary like he just types up notes or he takes notes. I mean, he's in charge of hiring people for the Communist Party, which is the Bolshevik Party. Lenin did not like him. He was a little scared of him. He's a power-hungry guy. Lenin didn't necessarily trust him. So when Lenin dies, there's going to really be two options between the Communist Party members or the Bolshevik Party members. Is it going to be Trotsky? Is it going to be Stalin? Stay tuned to find out who it is. Next Ed Puzzle, we'll go over what happens after Lenin's death, how Russia changes. Do they industrialize? Are they going to be successful? What's going to go on? Watch the next one. Have a good day.